And thirdly, as someone was just saying to me, they find it critical realism really useful but hard work at first because the pure philosophy realism books are written in rather an abstract way. And many of us, like me, find it hard to understand something unless we have a practical example. So when I work through the slides, what I hope you'll all do is come up with practical examples that illuminate it for you to share with all of us. There's only about 25 slides, so if we sort of go along slowly and you bring in examples, that would be nice. And as it's a 2-hour session, maybe we'll have, say, a 10-minute break halfway through. If we get through the slides quite quickly, then I'll ask you to get into groups and talk a bit more about how you would use some of the ideas, and then we'll share that out. Did you want to put any more spare chairs by the door before we begin, Rachel, so that all... That's a good idea. Do you want to pass it to me?
The other piece of business is that there is a sign-in list going around. If you could just initial by your name or check your name, or if you're not on there, add your name to the list. That would be great.
Now, I expect there's a big range of people who know quite a lot and people who are beginners. I hope I don't go too fast or too slow, so certainly stop me if you'd like things to be clearer. Right. I'd also like to point out that the people who wrote the original books took about 10 to 20 years writing them and working them out. And Roy Basker, the main founder, I expect you all know he runs free fortnightly seminars here that anyone can go to. And I hope as you get more, the beginning people get more interested in it, they feel like going to the seminars. So I'm going to cover this evening topics that he covers over weeks in much greater depth. This is just an introduction. Also, if you want more background, there's the first 3 chapters of my book on critical realism going into detail about this session. So first of all, to make it really clear, because some sociologists get really cross with philosophers and think that they're coming in and they're going to tell us what to do, and if we start doing philosophy, everything's going to get terribly boring and erudite and far too micro-detailed. And critical realism is meant to be exactly the opposite. Not the master builder, but the under-labourer who clears away the rubbish and provides the tools for people to use in any way they want to. And that's partly why the critical realism books are so abstract. I think it's that they don't want to venture into social science, they want to leave that to the social scientists. So it is a toolkit for researchers, it's not a form of sociology. And the aims of critical realism are to raise and clarify uncertainties, and quite a lot of things we take for granted and maybe don't think is a problem until we start thinking about it. Resolve contradictions, confusions, disagreements. Connect opposing theories, and I'm going to outline 2 very opposing ones, and then show how critical realism can bring them together. And that will increase the strength and validity of our work and its power and relevance, because I think a lot of people feel very impatient with social scientists, and particularly sociologists, saying, oh, they can't agree among themselves, so who's going to believe them? And one lot going for facts and statistics, and the other lot going for, do we really know anything's happening, and how do we know? And the 2 don't seem to meet at all. And critical realism is a way of resolving these differences. Now, I'm using childhood as the example through this, but you could apply it to any topic. And for childhood studies research, the new childhood studies, by the way, could you put your hands up if you sort of know about or are involved in childhood studies? Quite a lot of people. And anyone here from child psychology and development? Or no. It's just as, I expect you know there is quite a difference from the longer tradition of child development and the newer international childhood studies. But we don't really all agree with each other about what childhood means and how we should study it. And we're getting more and more perhaps fragmented into subspecialties. You know, there are the geographers and the historians and the social care people and so on. Can we bring them all together to have a rich and more coherent idea of childhood? 20 years ago, when things began, I think a lot of us were really concerned that children, as women used to be, were so excluded from the mainstream literature. And would you agree that until the 70s or 80s it was men? But even today, open any book on politics, law, climate change, housing, look at the index, children, young people, not usually there, not usually thought of. It tends to be adults as economic agents that everyone is thinking about. And yet, of course, across the world, a third of people are aged under 19, perhaps under 15, because so many births are not registered. We don't, you know, there really are estimates of the population. But we can't have a clear idea of the world's needs and the different societies if we ignore a third of the people. As women used to argue, how can you understand society? Women, lots of feminists say, if you forget half the people, but when they say that, they're missing out children and young people who are 1/3. And so really, childhood studies did hope to get the childhood more into the mainstream, and you would hope also more of the mainstream will get into childhood studies, into how does housing or benefits or new policies affect children. And really, so much of it is still on the personal side of children's lives: play, home, school, protection, child health. And would you agree that we don't really have enough about neoliberalism and global policies and how they are affecting children? Now, critical realism offers ways to connect theories and methods and these great wide range of topics, and also ways to validate and ground our conclusions. So when people say, you know, prove it, or how relevant is your work, or how do you justify and validate your work, there are useful ideas here. And therefore, we can move on from our evidence towards our conclusions and our recommendations for policy and practice with more confidence, I would suggest. There's the whole debate about whether we should be value-free or whether we should work for emancipation and children's rights and greater freedoms and respect for them. That's another debate in critical realism. And then there's the debate about empiricism, facts versus interpretivism. And so often these two don't just contradict each other, they are defined in a way in relation to each other. So just to start with empirical or positivist social and natural science, and it's based on this idea of the remote researcher who doesn't interact with the research subjects and tends to abstract them from their context, isolate them and study them as separate variables. One example in a way is the birth cohorts. We've got millions of data, but we don't know about the individual children and how these all connect in a life. They're supposed to be presented as objective, self-evident, value-free facts. They just speak for themselves. There's such a huge mass of data that they stand up alone. And rather set apart from their social context, except in covariate analysis. So all these facts and data are all seen as, in a way, independent, pristine. the same whoever observes, reports or reads about them. You know, the number of mothers who go out to work full part-time and so on, it just seen as a fact, where actually it's awfully complicated in reality. The facts are seen like a child, a household, a neighbourhood, are seen as having essential, inherent qualities that are stable, lasting reality out there in the world, unchanged in time and space, so that I could talk equally in Australia or Hong Kong about the data in the cohort studies, and everybody might receive them in the same way and they will be intact. And on the whole, there isn't that much attention to differences of words and meanings, so that images, neuroscans, statistics are taken almost as objective data. Would anybody like to disagree with this, by the way, or comment on the summary? Right, so my two others are that, oh yes. Yeah.
I was just thinking in my head, wasn't there a lot of, in the 70s, particularly in relation to women, a lot of discussion with people like Alderson and Farland saying, well actually, statistics are constructions to some extent, sort of people who were dealing with these kind of things making the same kind of comments that you're making.
Some of them were, but she belongs to the radical statistics group, doesn't she? She's not very typical of statisticians, really, Alison McFarlane, is she? And so in a way she makes the point that she's criticising her discipline for, on the whole, being like this, would you say? And on the whole, both the statisticians and economists who present the data and the politicians who quote and cite it tend to take this attitude to research data. And so the last two attitudes are that they can be used to prove general laws, replicable findings, reliable predictions, and that evidence-based findings yield self-evident conclusions. You know, certain children behave badly linked up to certain likely antecedents, and so therefore we should tackle single-parent families, something like this. And that supports effective policy making and problem solving. And so examples of all this kind of work, which is very much favoured by the government and the research councils and very much funded by them and used by them, include lab experiments, psychology tests, school exams. More and more school exams are taken as a measure of the school and the nation in the global race. The birth cohort surveys of children's learning and behaviour, mental health, crime, and surveys of parents and teachers' views about children, although increasingly children are now also interviewed for their own views. Okay, so that's the empirical positivist approach to research, which not everybody agrees with completely wholeheartedly, but that tends to be the general practice in many large funded research projects here. Would you agree? I saw that. I think our institution, did it draw in 78 million or 278 million? Something astronomical, the director's report last week. Did anyone read it? Right, well, it's all in your email boxes, the staff, waiting there. A stupendous amount of money was raised for research, largely of this description. Now, in contrast, and the sociology of child particularly emphasised this about 20, 25 years ago, is the hermeneutic. Hermeneutic meaning this kind of double interaction, so that the adult might be saying, oh, you little child, I'll help you, or oh, you're a victim, I'll rescue you, or oh, you're a strong, resilient, resourceful, contributing child, I'll have a more equal relationship with you. And as researchers pointed out, Trans Solberg, a Norwegian researcher, 4-year-old said, you're treating us like little children. And 10-year-old Amy, who had achondroplasia, she was very short. I was doing research about children's consent surgery, and I said, oh, you're having your legs made longer. And she said, I suffer from achondroplasia and I'm having my femurs lengthened. And she transformed the patronising adult child into not just really an equal relationship, but she was the expert who informed me. And so very much if we set up this dyad that tends to enforce and reinforce itself as we go on, it affects our research very much, and science researchers are saying, you know, be careful what dyad you're setting up. It can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, and don't mistake it for reality. Now, again, 4-year-olds in nurseries, I was watching them yesterday, and you know, when somebody falls over, oh darling, are you all right? And Antonella Invernetti, have any of you read her work in Peru with street traders? And really young boys, aged 4, 5 and 6, were agreeing with their mothers that they would learn more and earn more if they set up their own, not store, but they just sat on their own with their goods. And they knew how to manage this, and they were treated in a way, in adult ways. So that the way we expect and behave and encourage children to behave enormously affects what their capacities are and seem to be. This is moving hugely away from the fact-based approach. The difficulty, of course, is then in getting into relativism. Is there any reality? Is there any real child there? Are there any real standards or ways that we ought to behave towards children, ought to protect them and expect from them? If we think, as some anthropologists do, for example, that in each place the morality and the meaning-making makes sense in that place, in that context, and they wouldn't elsewhere, then it can be very difficult to compare different areas and to have a general morality and general idea of rights. Is there any way around this problem of relativism and of transferring meaning? And yet, of course, on the other hand, anthropologists and others come back from these places, write their journal papers and their emails and expect them to be transferable to a large extent and to make sense to us. So in a way there's a split between the theories, everything is contingent and local, and the practice, oh well, I can transfer ideas and meaning across the world. More questions about research, or whether it's functional, is everything is organised in society to function as well as possible for the good of the majority. And if people are not behaving well, we need to socialise children more, or punish or exclude people, or reform them and get them to conform again into this society. Or else the contrasting one of critical theory, where everyone is competing for scarce resources, power, control. There's a huge intergenerational differences going on at the moment, say in this country, of the way the cuts are particularly hurting younger people and protecting older people. And whether conflict and can sometimes be a benign and positive reaction towards improving society and changing it. Yeah. Oh, I think I've missed out. Yeah, I've missed out 2 things, which is how actually interpretive research is defined in opposition to positivist empirical research. And I'll just go through this to show you differences, because in interpretive research there aren't such things as facts. We are creating and constructing, shifting things. We can't set anything away from its social context and really understand it. Facts, or the data that we collect, are not independent, standalone, like the little thing under the microscope. Pristine, whoever looks at that thing will see the same. Take any child And each of us will probably have a different picture, story and idea in our minds. So are there any essential inherent qualities in any of us? Is there a stable, lasting reality out there in the world, unchanged across time and space? Or are all of these things our own interpretations, constructions, not only the person who creates, say, a neuroscan, but the person who reads it? And of course there's quite a lot of criticism of neuroscans, saying they're blobograms and they don't really mean much at all. They simply something lighting up. What does it tell you that you didn't know anyway? There's all that debate going on. Can social science evidence data prove any general laws at all? And if one person does a survey or some action research and somebody else comes in, can they replicate it exactly? Well, no. But does that mean that no findings at all are transferable or relevant or useful in other settings? And what can we do about causes and effects? Effective policy making and problem solving if everything is so contingent, shifting and individually understood, interpreted and acted on. And the point of critical realism partly is to draw these two opposing ideas together. So the aims of my book are to introduce critical realism, and it only is the first rung of the ladder. And I've been going to Roy's fortnightly seminars for 5 years now, and every time I go I learn something more. It's a matter of just going on and on, learning it more, like learning a language in a way. And we're all always learning our language, aren't we? New words, new meanings, new ideas. Now, critical realism in the book, I want to look at gaps and absences, as well as achievements and contradictions in childhood studies, and look at how they can address and resolve them. I want to get more people aware of childhood studies, because lots of people just don't know about it, and think that child development psychology is childhood studies, and that's all we need to know. And I also want to look at how childhood studies can contribute a great deal to critical realism and connect childhood more into the adult world of research and policy, just as feminism did for women. So looking at how economics, politics, justice, war, trade, states, markets, climate change, all particularly affect children. That's mainly the second volume of the book I'm still writing. And there aren't that many ways that look at children in really adult ways, particularly with critical realism. And Phil Mizzen, his work in Accra in Ghana is a marvellous exception. Also, I expect you know about the Oxford Young Lives studies, do you? They're not using critical realism, but what they are doing is using, working in 4 different continents, a huge amount of 15 years of longitudinal research and detailed ethnographic studies and interviews, and combining all kinds of different data and research methods and research disciplines together to understand childhood. And also I want to draw together the macro and micro. So that I've got 4 main chapters in each of my books, and the first is on bodies and the other will be on nature and ecology. One will be on interpersonal relationships and looking particularly at economics as that, then structures around childhood, and then ethics and personal flourishing. I'm going to go through these in a bit more detail. Now, the first thing, critical realism, the critical really refers to Marx, and a great deal of this draws on Marx's work. And Marx said, do you know where he said history begins? Does anyone know where Marx said history begins? With bodies and searching for food. I'm just reading a book about Marx and ecology, and his PhD was about ecology. He was very worried about the way the world was changing and the way everyone was getting dragged into cities and how bad it was for their bodies and their health. And so he's very material, very physical, very real about human life. And so Roy began by saying that everyone thinks that we can't just naively and simply adopt natural science methods, positivist ones, for social science because they're just too simple and basic. But what he says is this assumes that there's a huge difference between natural and social science, and that the natural scientists deal with things and social scientists deal with ideas that are floating around. He said, well, natural scientists deal with ideas, eureka, gravity, evolution. You can't actually hold gravity or evolution and look at it. They are theories, they're imaginative ideas that are plausible, lasting explanations, but they're still theories. And we cannot ever see them except in their effects. So we see lots of falling stones, but we don't see the gravity that actually drags them down. And I said, well, in that way, it's like social science. We observe lots of things. Underneath are the deep causal powers that bring about these effects. Now, if we collect lots of data, like in the birth cohorts of people's lives, housing, education, health, and try to trace patterns between them like covariables, that's a bit like looking at lots of falling stones and saying, oh, that's interesting. Are there patterns in the falling? Are the stones affecting one another? Was Aristotle right to think that stones fall because of their weight, their gravitas? And is the power and the cause inside the objects and their relationships? And of course Newton said, well, no, it's not that at all. To explain what's going on, you have to look at the invisible hidden cause of gravity. Similarly, Roy said, well, for social science, when we look at inequality, poverty, crime, failure in schools, it's not enough just to look at the visible evidence of the style of teaching, the observed behaviour of people and what they say. We need to look at the deeper causes of class, gender, racism, and so on. And they have as much strength and validity as scientific explanations of evolution or gravity. And this idea of retroduction is that kind of eureka leap of imagination, of connecting the visible to some deeper cause, and then working really hard to demonstrate the links. So naturalism is a scientific research method, and the possibility of naturalism is to transfer it to social science and to say how much more similar social and natural sciences are. They're not identical, but there is a unity to them. I'm not sure if I say it later on, but that's right, I'll leave that. Now to go for this idea of hermeneutics and interpretivism, and when we see a child, what we see is our idea. When we see this 12-year-old girl, we might see an orphan, a very deprived, disadvantaged girl. Or we might see a very strong, resilient householder who is looking after her two sisters. A recent study in South Africa of thousands of homeless children and young people found that most of them would much rather stay and live with their siblings than to be moved into adult-run households. So shifting transitive perceptions, not just our imposition of our ideas, but how people make meaning of themselves, are vital in understanding existing entities. And they do partly reshape them. It's not a matter of the idea is there and the thing and the reality is there. The idea shapes how people behave, react, respond. But maybe social scientists have become too much seeking refuge in idea and social constructions and are worried about facts and independent, fixed, intransitive reality. I think some childhood researchers think that if you peel away the layers of the onion of all the behaviours, beliefs, behaviours and that, you won't get to any child in the end. They'll just be. And also some researchers with the body suggest that we don't really have bodies. All we have are how we perceive and enact bodies without organs and so on. And would you like to give any other examples of quite extreme social constructions that have you come across? I know most people here are quite practical and policy oriented and probably don't spend a lot of time reading deeper theory.
I think in one session last term we were talking about how puberty could be a social construction.
Very interesting. Puberty, yes. Because a lot of people are really unhappy about it, how it's imposed on young people and used either to excuse or explain or accuse them of their behaviours and dismiss it. So puberty, it is very much a social construction in terms of it's an industry and there are loads of experts with a lot of power and income from, and it's an idea that has gripped the whole world and is used very much so. But has it got any reality at all, do you think? And if so, what would that be?
Reproduction.
What, people become capable of reproduction? Yeah, actually puberty's been stretched from 8 years up to 25, hasn't it? So it seems to be a social status that's been ascribed to whole of people. You could say it's a genetic sexual time of life changing of the body, and that is a reality. But it doesn't usually stretch over about 13 years or more. So there is definitely, wouldn't you say, biochemical and physiological changes in the body that could be called puberty. But then to transfer it onto a whole lot of behaviours, relationships, status is a very complicated thing, and it's important to make the difference. Would you agree, Elizabeth, or what are you thinking?
Yeah, no, I was just thinking about the similar, adolescence is another one. What is adolescence?
Yes, it was invented in 1904, wasn't it, with this great tome that goes on and on and on about bodies, menstruation,
but it kind of came into public consciousness in the 1950s, really, which has interesting repercussions economically.
Yeah, yeah. And also in the early 20th century, in America, there were so many immigrants, they were really worried about only 10 years of education, and they felt 20 years was going to meld the whole nation into a more unified whole if they had more schooling and more college. And that was a great reason to put a longer distance between childhood and adulthood. And so there were political and economic reasons for this, but that doesn't turn it back into a wholly biological fact. Yeah.
Okay. Just to clarify, so take your example of adolescence, then the transient reality is the fact that there is a sudden speeding up in physiological change at a certain point, and the transient reality is the notion of adolescence as some kind of mystical thing that does terrible things to people and accounts for all sorts of behaviours.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Would you all agree with that? That there is a reality there, a factual, physiological, and also it's in a way it's to some degree universal around the world. So it is a genetic human trait.
some people would say it goes from 8 to 23. I think most of us would sort of say, oh, you know, my daughter, my son, it's kind of 11 to 14, and then whatever. It's different for different children. But you're kind of citing some quite extreme examples, but I think they're the minority.
Well, then, when they say my daughter, my son, 11 to 14 is going through puberty, they then say, and that explains why
Some people
they're
do,
all
but
moody.
some
And
people do.
also, there's this whole thing about hormonal adolescence and volatile. Goodness,
That's
at
quite
other
an
age-
ignorant construction of it, though.
Yeah,
so that's
because
quite
it's very age-based, though, isn't it? I mean, do you often hear 40-year-olds described as who behave in the same way?
no, exactly.
Or nowadays, 7 and 8-year-olds, oh, they're pre-puberty. It's used as, on the whole, a term of rather denigration, isn't it?
Yeah.
And then it's used in public policy, like child and adolescent mental health services are 13 to sometimes 18 or 25. So that is quite a long stretch where you're in CAMS in that category of adolescents.
Yes, which is a big problem from the law, because the law changes when you're 18, and that tends not to recognise it. Yeah.
And
that's
also, you know, the notion of competence. When is a child competent? What is a competent child?
Yes. And how much is a competence actually in their thinking and skillful doing, or in our expectations, or in the amount of practice they have, or in the scaffolding in which adults help them to become more competent very quickly sometimes. What actually, is it fixed, or is it a capacity that's very transitional and changeable? And how all of us can be very competent in some settings and very de-skilled, nervous, and being terrible in others. And that's how really the transitive, people's attitudes and behaviours, really affects our deep behaviours and can shape it. So that there is this interaction between them, a big overlap between them. But at some point there is the intransitive idea and the transitive idea and the intransitive physical change, or actual inability to speak French, or whatever it is. Now, also, if we think there's an intransigent reality, we can respect people with their own lives and histories, being there before we look at them and being there after. Whereas in some childhood research, there is rather an implication that, oh, when they arrive at school, we all behave in this particular way, and my research has shown you the picture of the child, and it can be quite a superficial picture because we don't know what happens to them before and after school and so on. And also, it encourages us to stand back and not impose our perceptions on this school child too much, thinking actually they're an independent person in many ways with other lives that we don't know about. So intransitive realities and transitive perceptions certainly interact, but also there is at some point where they could be separated. Would anybody like to give an example where they think they can't be? Or perhaps an easy way to ask it is, would you like to give examples of where you think people don't recognise the difference enough? They reduce one into the other too much.
I think maybe labels like autism, people think they know what they mean by autism, but actually it covers a much wider range than most people.
Very good example. And that shapes the way they behave to the person and sets up the hermeneutic of, oh, you're autistic, I'm sane and normal, and yes, and also maybe protests and denial from the autistic person will be used to increase the idea they're autistic instead so they're in a catch-22 really, and if they protest, they just sink ever deeper into the role in other people's views. And a lot of childhood studies is about trying to rethink that and rescue people from that. But then you can get to the other extreme where autism does not exist at all. And then you have the terribly hard research work of thinking, well, what is it? What sort of its nature, its function, and how are its cause and effects known? Yes. Now, another thing is, it seems terribly basic and simple, but there's epistemology and ontology, and people use the words all the time, and they mystify epistemology, saying, oh, it's thinking about thinking or something. But if we call epistemology thinking, and ontology being and living and doing, the two are really different. And the epistemic fallacy is when the being and doing is collapsed into the thinking. And Roy argues that researchers do this all the time. And so things are collapsed into thoughts. So real children are collapsed into abstract ideas about childhood, or like such as developmental stages, or images of victim children, statistics, social constructions. Would you like to give me any examples of epistemic fallacies? Anything you think of that's a thing that in research has been collapsed into a thought?
I'd like to see how it's different from the transitive and intransitive realities that you were giving examples.
It's a bit similar, yeah.
I can't.
Except the transient and intransient is the way to separate the two. And the epistemic fallacy, it points out that we're always collapsing the doing into the thinking. I'll give you an example. Oh, bother. I'm not sure if it's on these slides, but the way that positivism collapses, you'd think that positivism, interested in facts, will be very interested in ontology and real being and doing. However, when you look at the research, the data is usually statistics or groupings, interpretations, theories, policy proposals, generalizations, and in a way the individual children who were the givers of the data get lost in the positive researchers' organised, presented data. Would you agree, do you think? Now, with interpretive research, again, you'd think that we would be really interested in observing the being and doing of children. But we're very interested in how this is socially constructed, interpreted, understood, hermeneutically, and we react, and then children react in a certain way to us. So the whole thing actually gets your real child, whoever that is, gets sort of collapsed into our ideas about how people behave and interact. Well, would you like to give me any examples where you think people have really concentrated on ontology in research?
I'm going to give it a go, but
yeah.
Can you just tell me if it's totally wrong?
Yeah.
I'm in my second year of my PhD now, but I've got a background in teaching. I've got a background in primary school teaching, and my supervisor said to me, you need to stop thinking like a teacher, because that's kind of affecting your focus of your study. So my being, or my kind of living as a teacher, and what I know, is affecting my kind of knowledge about my kind of focus on my study. Is that kind of an example?
Very good, yeah.
Is it?
And also, the thing that childhood studies really has learned from anthropologists is when you go to your strange island, you don't sort of walk in and try and interact, and you don't try and make sense of it. You like a classroom, you know, think, oh, they're doing that because they've got ADHD or something like that. You try to see what is going on. Why are people doing that? What are they thinking and doing and being? What is the nature and function of being a child or being a parent in this example? And it's very, very hard to suspend. I mean, even the word parent is a kind of an epistemology because it positions the person in a certain set of relationships and history and all sorts of things. We can't suspend our epistemology. We wouldn't know anything about it. But we can try to hold back and really think about the being and doing of the children concerned. I've got an example later on of somebody doing that. So now another is the semiotic triangle, and again this is a rather extreme example of theoretical social science. But if you know about semiotics, the idea is that you have the signified, which is the idea in your mind of a child. I mean, even to look at a person and say, you are a child, is an epistemological thing to do in a way, because it puts them in a set of social relationships, history and all the rest of it. And it's often hard to see past that label to whoever is there. But there's our concept of the child, and then there's a signifier like, you know, girl, kid, infant, whatever we use. And some of them say, oh, there's nothing else, there's not a real child. But critical realism says that the way we can ground our research, validate it, make it justifiable and real, is to look as far as we can at the referent, the child, their being and their doing. I know it sounds extreme, but an awful lot of research really is about the concepts and the way we describe and explain them and label them. So, Roy said critical realism is grounded in this original reality. We were researching in 4 neonatal units. This was years ago, before I came across critical realism. And we could ground our reports in the real buildings, the time, the space, the noise, or quiet, the policies, the staff teams, the babies, the families. There were social interactions and emotions and suffering and morbidity and mortality. Babies really died. Babies really were very ill indeed with malfunctioning organs and so on. So there was this reality, and at the time I think I should have been much more confident that there really was this reality and we could compare the 4 units, because do some of you, when you're researching in different sites, feel, well, it's not really fair to compare them? We can't, because they're each their own entity with their own standards and reasons for functioning as they do. Did you feel that, Eleanor, sometimes?
Yes, I'm thinking about 2 countries, and is there a point of comparing the children's voices in this country and the children's voices in another country? Is there any point in doing that? And I don't know, I'm not sure.
That's a great example, because again, if children are really unheard and quite oppressed and exploited maybe, is that a reason for listening to their voices? Or if everyone that you speak to in that country thinks children not relevant, they haven't got people to listen to, or we're too poor or disadvantaged to have time for all this, what's your answer? What is your answer?
I suppose my answer would be about justice and human rights. That those they change, but they still remain, whatever the situation.
Yes, and then we've got to think about whether human rights have an ontology, an independent existence, which is going to be the topic next time. So, should we move on from it? But I think I was just not strong enough against the doctors, who of course have their very, very grounded research, policy and practice, to say, well, of the 4 units, one was very baby and family friendly, one was very unfriendly, and the other 2 were in the middle, and we could have compared them more, and morally, and we could have I think, done more to try to persuade the unfriendly ones to change. And at the time, it didn't seem the right thing to do. I mean, have any of you others come across sort of unfair differences that felt it's not our job to do too much about it? We just observe and describe and give people evidence they can use. What do you think, Lisbeth?
Well, I think that's part of the job of being a researcher.
What?
Is actually looking and making statements.
Pointing out inequality and yes. Do you others agree? Do you think we should be standing up for justice?
I think it's very difficult because you can end up just describing. It's difficult to know when. I'm just thinking of the example of how much time children get in clinical settings in order to have interaction directly with health professionals, and what the evidence points out is the reason they don't is because parents have a very strong urge to take up that time to understand all those sort of, how do the machines work and so on, and so children are sidelined as much as anything by parents. So it seems very hard. It is hard to say, oh, well, you should have appointment times that are half an hour instead of making those kinds of challenges feels very difficult.
Yeah. Actually, I think you've also said why the semiotic triangle is so important in childhood, because so often the referent, the child, is missing or overlooked. And the adults are talking about their procedures, their practices, their knowledge, their plans, their ambitions. And childhood studies is much more about really thinking hard about this triangle and the perspective of the child and their valid knowledge and being. Oh, the next thing is natural necessity. As I said, the falling stones. And David Hume, the philosopher, insisted that science should only look at the evident, the visible, not waste time with theorising and imagining, and to look at the stones and the patterns between them, which is a very limited kind of science. And so critical realism is about the three levels. And first of all, there's the empirical sensed level. And actually, when I look at you, it's not simply a matter of that you are the facts sitting there. In order to see you and make sense of you empirically, I have to interpret that, oh, you're sitting here because you've come for a lecture to discuss an idea. So there has to be a lot of imaginative and intuitive working in anything that we look at in order to know what it is. I mean, even if you look at a knife, to know it's a knife and what it means and how it's used, brings in lots of ideas that Hume pretend didn't happen. We have to make sense of things as well as to sense them. Empirical meaning taken in through our five senses, but also, as critical realism points out, processing it through our thinking. Then there's the actual things that happen, the events, the people, the objects, the actual road accident, the actual broken limbs. So the difference between empirical and actual is that the empirical would be our witnessing and making sense of the road accident, or experiencing it, wondering about it, and also seeing and taking part in it. However, and these are the levels of much observational and statistical research. And particularly in social science, we tend to ignore the real. And by real, that means causal and the natural necessity in things like gravity, like evolution. And they're all unseen, unprovable forces, only visible in their unpredictable random effects. But we can rely on ideas of gravity and evolution because so far nobody's disproved them. Can natural necessity in physical science apply to social science? Well, causal, deep causal powers include people's motives and reasons for action. So if I decide to lift my arm, that was a real cause. Now there are structures of class, race, generation, ethnicity, inequality. Generation has not that much been researched as one of the massive causes of global movements. Look at the protests around the world. So many of them are being organised by very well educated, young, unemployed people. It's a huge generational economic inequality. Now, the statistical analysis of separate variables like housing and parenting follows this falling stone's hues. Instead of looking for deeper unseen causes. Now, one reason we don't look for unseen causes is people will say, I'll just give you the example. You hear it so much on the debates about politics and ethics. Oh, poverty doesn't stop children failing. You always get bright children from the working classes who get into Oxford. Therefore, that disproves that poverty is a cause of educational failure. And this is a classic way of looking at the visible evidence and not the causes. How can we look at the causes in a reasonable, justifiable way? Well, we have to think about open and closed systems. So in natural science, like experiments and drug trials, there are very rarely 100% results. You try a cancer trial, never would 100 people get better on it and nobody get worse or stay the same. They wouldn't do the trial if it's that obvious. So natural science doesn't have this 100%, the argument about the bright child getting to Oxford demands of 100% proof before you believe in a cause. So social science has even less clear results than natural science. It's complex and unpredictable and non-replicable, and therefore we can't generalise from it, can we? But, as I've said, RCTs, randomised controlled trials, don't have this 100%. Now, closed systems where one overwhelming force is working are very rare. So even with gravity, for example, we see birds, planes fly upwards, leaves spiral about in the wind, but we don't think that disproves there's gravity going on. We know that it's an open system with more than one force working in it. Gravity is working against jet engines or bird flight, other powers, other causal powers. And in the natural and social science, there are almost always open systems, two or more competing causal powers. Right. And so, when there are more than one power, powers are determining, they're hugely influential, but they're not determinists. They don't absolutely control 100%. Just as one bird doesn't disprove gravity, one clever child getting into Oxford doesn't improve the power of social inequalities that drag down people like gravity unless they have exceptional other systems working for them. Does that sort of make sense? Do you sort of agree with that? Because it's another step towards saying that social science and natural science are actually more similar than we often think, and we can be a bit stronger about our claims about class, inequality and poverty. We don't have to come up with results that are even better than science does. And when you think about the CERN thing under the Swiss Alps, you know, they've spent years and years and years building this thing to try and construct a closed system so that only the velocity will work, nothing else will interfere with it. That shows how very rare in science this 100% thing is. Have you heard people saying, you know, oh, clever children getting into Oxford go? I mean, do you think that's a plausible response from social science, saying there are different competing, complicated, strong causal powers in our lives, but that doesn't disprove them?
That's really helpful, because I think that's an argument I always I know I disagree with when people say those statements, but it's incredibly hard to find a way to respond to it.
Yeah.
Because it's so easily, you know, you've written off a whole, you know, the clever child that kind of succeeds, or the, you know, those singular examples are so often used to suddenly disprove a whole element of the world, and I find it quite difficult sometimes to be able to come up with a response to that that's sound, I suppose.
Yeah. It
That's
makes you
helpful.
sound biased, and it makes you sound political, doesn't it? But that's opposing an unreal idea of natural science against an unreal idea of the weakness of social science.
Can't you just say on average?
I was going to say, isn't it partly a statistical point that evidence is not the plural of anecdote?
Yeah.
You can say that, but a lot of political people aren't really impressed, are they? But
You know, so their point about complexity and points about, you know, generalising from a poor sample.
yes, especially as some people say science, the point of it is prediction and replication, and since we can't really achieve either very clearly in social science, then it's dismissed as a non-science by many people. But then one answer is to question how often natural science can predict, and how much effort has gone into setting it up in artificially so that it only has one causal power working, whereas in everyday life there'll be lots of them. And a common example is some people who say, well, the randomised controlled trial with the word emphasis on controlled gets certain results, but in real life you're going to get different results because, for instance, you don't have the staffing and the attention to getting people to comply with the treatment and all sorts of things like that. That's not to say that they're weak or unimportant, it's to qualify them in the same way that we can accept qualifications of social science. Did you want to have a break, do you think, Rachel?
Sure. Yeah, if you want to do like a...
Everybody else, would you like a break? For about 10 minutes? Yeah, good.